Okay, in this video, I'm going to try something new, and that is going to be a reaction video. So the aim is to go through this video that Oversimplified made on the Cold War and elaborate on certain things. So if you're a person who has very little or no understanding of the Cold War, hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of what was the Cold War, why it was important, and what caused it. When it comes to the Cold War, basically in a nutshell, it was a ideological conflict between two superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. And this ideological conflict, which characterized global politics, kind of divided the world into two camps, kind of a bipolar division of the world, the United States of America and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies. And it had the potential, because of the existence of nuclear weapons, to wipe out humanity. But it stayed an ideological conflict because of that dangerous potential with the existence of nuclear weapons. The dilemma, kind of like the problem when it comes to understanding the Cold War, is that why did it happen in the aftermath of the Second World War between two former allies? The Second World War was the deadliest conflict in human history, and you would think that afterwards, the powers that emerged as the dominant powers would want to prevent something like that from ever happening again. And as I say, the United States and Soviet Union fought as allies during the Second World War. So why, immediately after, did they embark on a different conflict, one that was actually had the potential to be even deadlier than the Second World War? And that is kind of the whole dilemma about understanding the Cold War. The Cold War, generally, the dates that are given, it's about 1947 to about 1991 or 1989. Basically, the launching of the Truman Doctrine up until either 1989, when you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, or 1991, when the Soviet Union had collapsed. So this is kind of the dates. But basically, people will vary, but you can think of it as at the end of the Second World War, up until the communist countries started to fall apart with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. So that, in a nutshell, is what the Cold War was. Now, there's different perspectives of trying to understand the causes. Sometimes, people will date the causes, and this video here by Oversimplified is going to begin with 1917, with the rise of communist Russia. And the idea is that once Russia emerged and became a communist nation, the seeds for the Cold War were already put in place. This perspective is different to others that kind of see the causes of the Cold War being between kind of personality differences between the United States president at the end of the Second World War, Harry S. Truman, and the Soviet premier, Joseph Stalin. And Roosevelt, who was the United States president during the war, had died in 1945, replaced by Harry Truman, who had just recently become vice president of the United States, had a lot of catching up to do, looked at some of the interactions between the Soviets and the Americans or with Roosevelt, and believed that Stalin had taken advantage of Roosevelt. And it was kind of important to prevent Stalin from taking too much influence. And that's what some people will end up putting a bit of blame on Harry S. Truman for the causes of the war.
Year is 1917. Fighting rages on the Eastern Front of the First World War. Both Germany and Russia are on the brink of collapse. Soldier, I need you to bring me this man. Got it. Found him, sir.
All right, so the video is beginning with what's going on towards the end of the First World War. The First World War, at the time, it ended up being a very difficult war, a lot of stalemates, and towards the end, Germans are very, very desperate to try and weaken the Allies. And Russia is on the brink of collapse. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm was the German king, but as the war progressed, he was replaced by Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, who kind of ruled Germany. So Erich Ludendorff, who's pictured over here, realizes that a very effective way of weakening Russia, which is already at the stage like on the verge of collapse, would be to send Vladimir Lenin, who's in exile. And he's in exile in Switzerland. So the idea is if you put him on a sealed train, send him back to Russia with this dangerous idea of communism. And why I say it's a dangerous idea is he goes to Russia, spreads communist revolution, going to weaken the Russians' resolve to continue fighting the First World War, and it will get Russia out of the war. So the idea is to send him with this dangerous pathogen, so to speak, like communism. So obviously, if Lenin gets out and that communist message spread to German forces, it could be equally dangerous. So you could see it as being like a kind of pathogen. But put him on a SEAL train, send him to Russia, and get Russia out of the war. At this point in time, it was the Allies, well, France, the Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The United States hasn't quite joined the war yet, but if you send Lenin to Russia, you can get the Russians out of the war. The joke here is that he brings John Lennon, the Beatles singer, not Vladimir Lenin.
What? No, not Lenin. Lenin, the Russian communist. What? Why would I need a Beatle? Lenin, the Russian communist. He was exiled to Switzerland. You know what? I'll do it myself. Who wants to start a revolution?
Step into
Okay,
Wix
so
Studio,
this happened.
the web platform
But
for agencies and
that
enterprises.
is kind of Lenin's destiny to go and lead the Russian Revolution. It was a strategy by Erich Ludendorff, who's pictured over here, a German general who's kind of leading the German war effort at this point in time to weaken Russia, get them out of the war. This will sow the seeds of the Cold War that will happen later on.
The Germans put Lenin on a train and sent him all the way back to Russia, hoping he and his mates would create an internal crisis. And create an internal crisis they did. The government was overthrown, and Lenin was in charge. He immediately pulled out of the First World War, made the country communist, started a 3-year-long civil war, got shot, broke the economy, caused a famine, and then he died. On his deathbed he said, "Hey man, tell whoever's in charge of giving people jobs not to let that jerk Stalin become the next leader. By the way, who did I put in charge of giving people jobs? That would be Stalin, sir."
All right, so Lenin goes back to Russia. There's two revolutions that take place in 1917, but the second one is the one in which the Bolshevik Revolution, and they will have this kind of communist revolution. The joke over here is that Stalin wasn't really a significant replacement for Lenin, but by all intents and purposes would have been Leon Trotsky. But Stalin's position in the Communist Party, General Secretary, he was in charge of kind of allocating jobs, and he could put a lot of his allies or people loyal to him in positions, and he could get rid of enemies. And he managed to take control over the Soviet Union, as it would become known, after Lenin died. Now, something that won't be mentioned in this oversimplified video, but it is important to understanding the causes of the Cold War. Remember, there's two perspectives about the causes of the Cold War. Some see the causes of the Cold War happening during the interactions at Potsdam between Harry S. Truman and Joseph Stalin in 1945. Saw it as a clash of personalities, couldn't get along, laid the seeds for a future war. But other people see it 1917 as laying the kind of foundations for the Cold War. Because as early as this, when you had the Communist Revolution, immediately civil war broke out in Russia. And the American president, after World War I, or during the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson actually sent American soldiers to fight against the Bolsheviks, to fight against the communist leaders. So the United States and the Soviet Union were already enemies at that very early stage. And no American president, until Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, would recognize the Soviet Union. But they had a lot of advisors who were stationed in the Baltic states, neighboring the Soviet Union, and they were studying and observing. And they came up with this conclusion that the Soviet Union is like this neurotic bear. It's after world domination, it wants to spread communism. That is its intention. But during Stalin's time, it's not in a position of power. Okay, it has a lot of rebuilding to do, World War One destroyed its economy, wasn't industrialized in the first place. Stalin was trying to build it up. But they argued that the moment the opportunity would arise, the Soviet Union would try to spread this ideology of communism. It would take advantage. And they were kind of proven right during the Second World War. Because during the Second World War, when everybody was distracted by Hitler and Stalin, the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact, had agreed that if Hitler invades Poland, the Soviets would invade Poland. So if Hitler invades from the west, the Soviets would invade from the east. And that's exactly what happened. While the world or the Allies were distracted with fighting Hitler, Stalin invaded the Baltic states and he also invaded other neighboring countries. So they were kind of proven right. The United States would get bombed at Pearl Harbor, Soviet Union would get invaded by Nazi Germany, and both of them would enter in kind of a marriage of convenience because of a common enemy. But those hardliners in the American government who were warning about how dangerous the Soviet Union is, their ideas kind of had credence.
Stalin was a rising force in the Communist Party. He still had some opponents, but conveniently, all of them were arrested or disappeared. So that was lucky. And so Stalin took over. He implemented his 5-year plans, which transformed the country from an agriculture-based economy to an industrial one. And like Lenin before him, he reigned with terror. Anyone who dared criticize or oppose him would either be killed or left to rot in the horrendous Soviet work camps. Then a short man with a silly mustache tried to take over the world, punched the Russians all the way to Moscow, and then the Russians, with some help from their faithful ally, the Winter, punched them all the way back to Berlin.
Okay, so this is just brushing over things a bit quick. So, 1917, Communist Revolution. 1924, Lenin dies, Stalin takes over. Prior to Lenin's death, United States, Soviet Union already enemies. Stalin comes to power, all intents and purposes, more ruthless than Lenin. No diplomatic relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. What's not mentioned in this video is 1929, you had the Wall Street stock market crash, which initiated the Great Depression. Roosevelt would eventually become United States president, and relations between the Soviet Union and the United States would kind of mend a little bit. The Soviet Union would invite a lot of American engineers over to supervise the industrialization projects at a time that the United States is recovering from the Great Depression. Conditions are quite good. Roosevelt recognizes the Soviet Union, first American president to do that since 1917. But then Stalin introduces the Great Purges, and a lot of the Soviets that the Americans were working with find themselves being victims of Soviet or Stalin aggression, breaks relations again. A lot of the hardliners in the American government who had been warning that the Soviet Union are not to be trusted, kind of proven right. And then 1939, World War II breaks out. Hitler invades Poland. After about 2 weeks, Stalin and Hitler made an agreement that if Hitler invades Poland from the west, Soviet Union would invade from the east. Stalin stayed off a little bit, waited for about 2 weeks, saw how things were playing out. When it was obvious that the Germans were winning, he decided to get involved and they conquered Poland. Then he started attacking neighbors, and it looked like hardliners in the American government were correct until Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, did very, very well at first. Stalin ignored a lot of warning signs, was caught unprepared, but when Soviet winter hit, they managed to reverse and started to push the Germans back. At the same time, 1941, at the end of 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. United States get involved in the war. So now the Soviets and the Americans are fighting on the same side against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan.
At this point, being allies, America, the UK, and the Soviet Union were good chums. They held a
So
couple.
obviously Britain now is the one European country which was standing up to Nazi Germany, and now the Americans and the Soviets are assisting. This picture over here is more towards the end of the war, where Truman became president of the United States. But prior to this, it would have been Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill. And while the war was underway, they had met uh, Yalta and they had met in Tehran, and their final meeting would be in Potsdam with Truman. But the earlier meetings, relations, planning on how they were going to win the war, what would happen when the war came to an end. Then Roosevelt would die and Truman would become president. And some people would say that it was this period when Truman became president of the United States that the seeds of the Cold War were set in motion.
Couple of conferences near the end of the war to decide what would happen next. Hey, Stalin, after all your trials and tribulation.
Okay, this little extract over here. I think I'll just play it first and then explain.
You must be pretty happy to be standing here in Berlin. Tsar Alexander made it all the way to Paris. Hey, just give me a second. Hey, man, I think something's up with Stalin. I know, right? What should we do? Shall I tell him about the bomb? Yeah, tell him about the bomb. That will scare him. So, we got this crazy new big A-bomb that can destroy an entire city in one go. Yes, my spies told me already. Oh wait, I meant to act surprised. Wow, that's amazing. He already knew.
Okay, so some of the meetings between the three world leaders were quite amicable, but by Potsdam, a lot of things are changing. So the Germans surrendered, and later also, basically, leading up to the Second World War, 1938, the two German physicists had split the nucleus of an atom, showed that nuclear fission is possible. Leo Szilard had written to the American president, Franklin Roosevelt, warning about the Soviets being able to develop, the Germans being able to develop an atomic bomb. And because of that danger of Hitler developing an atomic bomb, the Americans financed the Manhattan Project, where they would develop the atomic bomb before the Germans could. And the bomb was finally successfully tested on the 16th of July, the Trinity test, and proven a success. Now, by this stage, Germany had already surrendered in the war. Japan was still fighting. Just before Truman went to Potsdam to meet Stalin and Churchill, he had news that the atomic bomb was detonated and it was successful. So this would become quite a good bargaining strategy in dealing with Joseph Stalin. So in this little extract where they tell Stalin, after all the trials and tribulations, it's good to see you here. And Stalin said, well, so Alexander made it all the way to Paris. Kind of puts questions, is he after expanding further, conquering Europe, spreading communism, just like a lot of American hardliners have been warning the danger of the Soviet Union? Is the Soviet Union going to become the next enemy? Now, the Soviet Union at this point in time had the biggest army, so it had a lot of leverage. It was already stationed in most of Eastern Europe. A lot of bargaining power. The Germans had surrendered, but the war's not over because Japan is still fighting. So the idea is that it's important for Truman to tell Stalin that he has a weapon that is capable of sheer utter destruction. Stalin apparently says, yes, that's nice. And the reason he does that is because he had spies in the Manhattan Project. Klaus Fuchs, who was part of the Manhattan Project, Stalin knew a lot about what was going on. In fact, Stalin probably knew more about the Manhattan Project before Truman did, because Truman, who had just recently become vice president of the United States of America, before Franklin Roosevelt died, wasn't really kept up to date with a lot of important developments. And once Roosevelt died, suddenly Truman is, they used to call him the Missouri haberdasher because he was a suit salesman in Missouri, but suddenly all this responsibility would come on his shoulders and he would have to make a lot of important decisions. But basically, at this point in time where they're using the potential of a nuclear weapon as a bargaining tool, dealing with Stalin, Stalin had already known about the American development of the atomic bomb. Now, again, the reason that the Americans developed the atomic bomb was to do it before the Germans did, but the Germans had surrendered. Now they're going to drop the atomic bombs on Japan to force the Japanese to surrender. Maybe a bit off topic as far as causes of the Cold War goes, but why did the United States drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Traditionally, the explanation was to bring about a quick end to the deadliest war in human history. The Second World War, deadliest war in human history, it's Japan is still fighting, and if you don't use something like the atomic bomb, what's the alternative? Send more American soldiers to Japan, drop more bombs, prolong the war, have more loss of life. Alternatively, you have this weapon that is capable of wiping out cities, drop them, demonstrate their power, force Japan to surrender. So that motive makes the United States, it's a reasonable motive. Why was roughly 100,000 people killed in Hiroshima and nearly another 100,000 killed in Nagasaki? It was noble motives. A lot of people died, but the alternative would be prolong the Second World War for longer and risk even more people dying. However, declassified after the Cold War came to an end, a lot of classified material became declassified, and there were other motives being debated. The Americans that intercepted messages were talking about surrender the moment the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, so maybe the atomic bombs weren't necessary. There was also mention by Truman and his advisors that if you use the atomic bomb and have a demonstration of its power, you would be in a better position to leverage against Stalin, who's getting very aggressive in the plans about post war reconstruction of Europe, potential revenge for what the Japanese did at Pearl Harbor, and also all this money that was spent building the atomic bomb, if you don't use it, would have also been something that they were also talking about. So there were a lot of motives behind the reason to use the atomic bomb. It's a very controversial decision, but those are just some of the motives. But nonetheless, they did drop the atomic bomb. They chose the city of Hiroshima because it was untouched by the Second World War. A city like Tokyo had already been bombed to the ground. So dropping an atomic bomb on Tokyo would not have highlighted how devastating that weapon was. But dropping it on a city like Hiroshima, which was still intact, so one moment you have a city, drop one bomb on it, wipe that city out, you can demonstrate how dangerous this weapon is.
How? Am I sure I want to send nuclear secrets via
Okay,
unsecure
so
public
this is
coffee
just going
shop
to be a
Wi-Fi?
quick
Am I ever?
setup with a sponsor.
Dude, use a VPN. And speaking of VPNs, if, like me, you take internet safety seriously, then you need NordVPN. NordVPN hides your online activities from outside intruders, preventing anyone from stealing your personal data and stopping your service providers selling your data to advertisers. With over 5,000 servers in 62 countries, it allows you to surf the net anonymously and securely. And it's simple to use. With just the click of a button, you can connect to a server halfway across the world, even allowing you to access streaming services from that specific territory. Say, for example, you wanted to watch a certain Oversimplified video that for some reason has been blocked in your country. With NordVPN, you can. It works.
This
Does
is
the
a clever way of making a joke to lead to the sponsor, the fact that Stalin knew about the atomic bomb because he had spies who had infiltrated the Manhattan Project.
A stand for atomic or ass? Then America dropped their big A-bomb on Japan, and World War II officially came to an end. Hooray, we won! Okay, so now it's time to establish the New World Order. Stalin, you're in charge of Eastern Europe. Now, we want you to let them all hold elections. Oh yes, of course, elections. And these elections will be free and fair, right? Oh yes, certainly, free and fair. Definitely free and fair. Communist, 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 communist. If that's not free and fair, I don't know what is.
Okay, so in the aftermath of the Second World War, Soviet troops had liberated many of these Eastern European countries from Nazi Germany, but the troops were stationed over there. It would be a Soviet sphere of influence, what's sometimes called the buffer zone of friendly states to the Soviet Union, because they always get attacked by hostile Western nations. So by having a buffer zone, it would help protect them. The kind of at this point in time, gonna oversimplify here, but there is what's sometimes called slicing up the salami tactics. In each one of these countries, there would a lot of the Soviet soldiers and officials who are there intimidate opposition, and through various techniques, they ensure that communist governments come to power in most of these Eastern European states.
Throughout Eastern Europe, Soviet puppet governments were established as a buffer zone between the USSR and the West, with Churchill proclaiming an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. The relationship between the old allies was deteriorating fast. Over the next few years, the British intervened in the Greek Civil War to prevent a communist takeover. In Turkey, the Russians began demanding more control of Turkey's sea access routes, which prompted the US to send their largest battleship to Turkey for a friendly visit. After World War II, Iran was now occupied by both the Soviets and the British, with an agreement to both pull out once the war was over. The British pulled out. Stalin was like, you know what? I think I might stick around. All in favor of kicking Russia out of Iran? You want to know something? You guys suck. Pressure from the UN forced the Soviets to leave, and with the establishment of NATO, the Soviets had no doubt that the West was out to encircle and destroy them. And America announced the Truman Doctrine, in which they basically said, those guys are not cool, cannot.
Okay, so in this kind of, just to simplify this again, in the aftermath of the Second World War, a lot of governments in Europe are on the verge of economic collapse. This is a potentially good thing for the Soviet Union if the goal is to spread communism, because if a government is on the verge of collapse and everybody's poor and there's devastation, they'll be more susceptible to something like a communist revolution. It becomes more appealing. If things are stable, they'll be less susceptible to a communist revolution. So the idea is that Stalin is kind of stepping back and hoping that the tattered states of the economies would result in communist regimes coming to power. As again, if you're a rich country and everything is okay, people have food on the table, communism doesn't sound that appealing. But if you're struggling and everything's going wrong, communism becomes more appealing. So Truman is also aware of this, launches the Truman Doctrine, helped protect Greece from falling into communism. And the Truman Doctrine is a huge departure on the isolationism which had characterized the United States prior to this. The United States got involved in the First World War, not intentionally. They tried to stay out of it. Various factors brought them into the First World War. They got involved. Woodrow Wilson tried to implement his 14 points. After the Treaty of Versailles, the way in which France and Britain kind of punished the losers of the First World War, the Americans pulled out again, had isolationism. But now with the Truman Doctrine, where Truman basically said there must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are attempting protecting themselves against armed resistance by armed minorities or outside pressures. So basically, it's committing itself to fighting against communism. That's how you can interpret the Truman Doctrine, a huge departure from the isolationism which had previously characterized the United States policy or international policy. And hence, this is why sometimes the Truman Doctrine is seen as the beginning of the Cold War.
Not be trusted, and we will do everything we can to prevent the spread of communism around the world. Many view this moment as the official declaration of the Cold War.
Help secure your website with GoDaddy. Encrypt your website state.
Back in Europe, everyone was living in a post-apocalyptic void brought on by the Second World War. Cities reduced to rubble, not enough food. It was terrible. This is great. The more they suffered, the more likely it is they'll turn to communism. Dude, you're really messed up. What's wrong with you? My father used to punish me severely. America realized...
Just a quick joke, because, Stalin's obviously one of the most brutal tyrants in human history, and he was abused by his father. So this Oversimplified is just making a joke about, Stalin sitting back and waiting for these economies to collapse so they're more vulnerable to a communist takeover. The United States, however, is realizing this, and it's in their best interest to make sure that these European countries, especially in the western part, who's are also becoming vulnerable to potential communist takeover, would recover economically and will then entrench their allegiance with the Western Bloc and the United States against the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union.
And quickly made a move. Under the Marshall Plan, they sent $12 billion to Western Europe for its economic recovery. The countries of Stalin's Eastern Bloc looked on with envy. Hey, Czechoslovakia, you want to come get some economic aid? Yeah, but I have to check with my mom first. Sorry, America. I can't come. This was a full-on economic battle raging between capitalism and communism in Europe. If the Western nations developed...
The United States, with Marshall Plan, offered a lot of money, a lot of loans, a lot of machinery to help Europe recover. They offered it to the Soviet Union and to the Eastern Bloc. And Stalin had turned it down. Molotov, his foreign secretary, they turned it down, and they told all their countries under their sphere of influence to turn it down as well. Czechoslovakia wanted to take Marshall Plan, but Stalin made it very, very clear that if they did, there would be serious repercussions. The reason that the Soviets turned down Marshall Plan or this aid was that they had a lot of spies, and they kind of saw the way in which the Americans had communicated this Marshall Plan to some of the Western European countries, and a bit of discrepancy in the way in which they communicated it with the Soviets. So they did not trust it, and then they told their countries under their sphere of influence not to accept Marshall Plan, and they did not accept it either. But for the United States, it ended up being a very huge success because by loaning these European countries this money and also by kind of Americanizing them, introduction of American companies, American machinery, rebuilt these European countries, but it also strengthened relations and made a kind of climate for good business with the United States moving forward.
Developed faster and better than the East, that would be a defeat for Stalin. So he set up his own rival economic recovery plan, which he called Comecon, and he also set up Cominform, which gave him more political control over the Eastern Bloc. But nowhere did this economic battle rage harder than in the city of Berlin. Caught over 100 miles behind Soviet lines, the city had been divided up between the
Okay, this is going to explain this pretty well, but may as well just explain it further. Nazi Germany was the main enemy during the Second World War, and after Nazi Germany was defeated, the Soviets, who had like kind of liberated Europe from the East, and the Allies, who had liberated Europe from the West, met in the middle. Germany became divided up or cut in half, so to speak. Soviet sphere of influence, or the East Germany went to Soviets, West Germany went to Britain, France, and the United States, and those blocks will eventually merge. So you'll have a West and East Germany. But the capital city of Germany, Berlin, was situated within East Germany. And it was also divided up between Soviet Union, Britain, United States, and France, and the British, United States, and French part would eventually merge into one. But it is within the eastern part of Germany. So Stalin is going to kind of, in this Cold War that is developing here, which is too dangerous for a direct confrontation. Nobody wants another World War. The United States at this stage has nuclear weapons. So it's a very dangerous situation. But at the same time, he doesn't want to lose any ground. So any symbolic victory that they can take, they will take it. Just going a little bit off topic, the Cold War is called the Cold War because it was an ideological conflict. But so Cold War never became a hot war where there was direct fighting between the Soviet Union and the United States. But I know, like some individuals, like Neil Ferguson, sometimes refer to the Cold War as being the Third World Hot War because of proxy wars. It was too dangerous for the United States and the Soviet Union to go to war with one another. But in other places, like Korea, which is going to get covered, like Vietnam, like Angola, superpower rivalry were played out in third world nations where there was killing and hot war, so to speak, but these were proxy wars of the Cold War. Berlin, at this point in time, there's a potential for something like this to happen. Stalin is going to try and introduce a Berlin blockade and see if close the roads that connect West Germany to West Berlin, which he has the right to do because those roads are in East Germany, and that's his sphere of influence. And will the Americans attack his blockade? And if they do, they will be responsible for the next war. So what are they going to do in response?
the Allies, and the western segments were still under Western control. East Berliners could travel freely to West Berlin, see the economic prosperity, and think, maybe this communism thing ain't so great after all. I'm gonna have fun tonight. You're home late. Oh, Stalin. I was just out with my friends. Friends? You stink of capitalism! You're out engaging in imperialist debauchery again! I swear, Ivan, I can't keep doing this. Stalin wanted the West out, so he said, hey, guess what? I'm blockading all of your supply routes to West Berlin. What are you gonna do about it? I suppose we'll just fly the supplies in. Alright, Truman, you win this round.
Okay, let's oversimplify this. 1948 to 1949 Berlin airlift was a huge victory for the United States, but it was also very difficult because it was very, very expensive. Now, Stalin blocked off the roads where supplies go into West Berlin. And what would the Americans do? If they attack his blockade, they will be responsible for a new conflict, and he has the right to block those roads. But if they don't do something, West Berlin starves. And the solution was a very expensive, difficult solution, but it showed a commitment to not abandoning their ally, West Berlin. And they used an airlift where they would fly in goods and keep West Berlin functioning. And eventually, Stalin will lift the blockade. This would be a huge victory, well, symbolic victory for the West again. Marshall Plan was a success. The Berlin airlift was a success. But 1949, two very dangerous things from the American perspective are going to happen. One, the Soviet Union is going to test and detonate an atomic bomb, which is going to have major ramifications. And the most populous country in the world, China, is going to have a communist revolution and become, by virtue of that, a potential ally to the Soviet Union. So things are going to get very dangerous in 1949.
Berlin airlift was an incredible undertaking and a major success for the Western Allies, and Stalin ended his blockade of West Berlin. His aggressive actions worried the West, but not as much as this did. The Soviet Union had developed their very own atomic bomb. The USA no longer had a nuclear monopoly. The world now knew that if a major war broke out between the two superpowers, it would be more destructive than anyone could imagine. So it was comforting when Stalin came out and said that war between the Soviet Union and the West was unlikely. Oh, wait, inevitable. He said it was inevitable. Hey, you know who I haven't checked in on in a while?
There was a speech which Stalin gave, and speaking to the back in this country of the Soviet Union, said that war with the West is inevitable. This kind of rhetoric is common, especially amongst the communist regime at that time. But given the context of what's going on now, it was definitely interpreted by a lot of United States policymakers as a very, very dangerous, again, um, thing to say, especially with the potential of a war between the Soviet Union and the United States with the existence of nuclear
My good
weapons.
friend China. Whoa, what happened to you?
Okay, now with China, this is kind of it's a good visual because it does give you perspective here. Now, from the American perspective, and Truman gets blamed for this, like they lost China. So at this point in time, communism is being seen as something that has to be contained. It's spreading, it's like a disease, and now the most populous country in the world gets communism. It's like, one day China is on the United States side, it's ally, next day it's communist. But in reality, it's a much more gradual process. There was a civil war that was taking place in China. And it's not like it was just something that happened overnight, which is how it was perceived at the time. It's very dangerous. The Soviet Union has emerged on the scene. They just developed an atomic bomb. Now the most populous country in the world has become.
What happened to them was a full-blown civil war that had been going on since 1927. The People's Liberation Army, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, successfully defeated the Republic of China, who fled to Taiwan. The now communist China and the Soviet Union signed a mutual defense treaty. This was terrible news for the West. But wait, there's more. After the Second World War, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. In the north, the Soviets set up a communist regime. In the south, America set up an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let
Okay, during the Second World War, Japan had conquered Korea and a lot of these um, East Asian nations, and the kind of allies had liberated them. The Soviets came in from the north, the Americans from the British from the south, and as the war came to an end, they just divided the country along the 38th parallel. The Soviets put Kim Il Sung as their leader in the north, would be the communist, and the Americans put Sigmund Reed, who would be their Western ally in the south, and these countries would function. Now, Sigmund Reed, by all intents and purposes, is as much, if not more of a dictator than Kim Il sung, but the Americans chose not to arm him, did not give weapons, tanks, military equipment. Kim Il sung, on the other hand, was equipped by the Soviet Union, and he wanted to invade. From the end of the Second World War, he wanted to invade from the north, conquer South Korea, and create one unified Korea again. But Stalin refused to give him permission. So he asked Stalin, can he invade? Stalin said no. But then in 1949, now that one, the Soviet Union have the atomic bomb, so they're got more power, and two, China, which is right there next to Korea, is also on the communist side. Stalin gives Kim Il sung permission, and Kim Il sung and North Korea will invade South Korea, initiating the Korean War.
That deceived you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Korea under their own regime. Now that he had the bomb, Stalin was feeling a little more cocky, and he finally gave Kim permission to attack. The North launched a surprise invasion of the South on June 25, 1950. With Soviet aid, the North Koreans steamrolled through, taking Seoul in just 3 days and replacing one ruthless dictator with another. The UN were freaking out and quickly created an emergency force made up of troops from 16 countries to defend the South. The West still held Busan and made landings at Incheon near Seoul. They pushed the North Koreans out of Seoul,
This is actually very important, this Korean incident, because kind of leading up to World War II, Hitler was behaving in very similar ways. He annexed Austria, invaded the Rhineland, annexed the Sudetenland, annexed Czechoslovakia, and the thing was appeasement, appeasement, appeasement. And the League of Nations had failed to stop Hitler. They appeased him too much until it became too late, and World War II took place, the deadliest war in human history. Now, the United Nations can't make the same mistake. So, if there's a country now that's violating, now from the Korean perspective, Korea is one country, it's artificially divided into two. But from the international perspective, South Korea has just been invaded by North Korea, and the United Nations has to do something. But it's a very dangerous situation. So they enable a kind of police force, as it's called, made up of volunteers from many countries to help the South Koreans against North Korea. Very, very dangerous situation here with China just north. General Douglas MacArthur, a World War II hero, wants to escalate the war if China gets involved. Truman puts his foot down, says no. There's rumors that MacArthur actually wanted the use of atomic bombs, and Truman had to insist, no, they don't. But nonetheless, Truman would fire Douglas MacArthur. Very risky move, considering that Truman's popularity at this point in time is waning. Douglas MacArthur is very, very popular, but this war will play out for the next 3 years.
Replacing the ruthless dictator that had replaced the first ruthless dictator with the same ruthless dictator that had previously been replaced by the new ruthless dictator. And the West then continued all the way up the Korean peninsula. At this point, China was getting worried that the UN may just keep going. The US had sent this guy to lead the operation. After winning the Pacific theater of World War II, General Douglas MacArthur's head was big, and his balls were bigger. He reassured President Truman that there was absolutely no way at all that the Chinese would ever get involved. Meanwhile, 500,000 Chinese troops were crossing into Korea. Nuke 'em. No. Nuke 'em! No! Ah, come on! You're fired. The US considered the nuclear option, but now that the Soviets also had the bomb, they didn't want to risk all-out global destruction. The communists pushed the West right back almost to the exact same spot they had all started from, and they ended up in a stalemate, where they remained until both sides finally agreed to work towards a peace settlement in 20.
Post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation, i.e. my dark spots, are my biggest skin concern. Packed with niacinamide and vitamin C, Olay Super Serum works in reducing the look of dark spots. Let me know what your skin concerns
Korean
are
War
and
is
read my
going to play
caption for
out like
more
that.
on where and how to tell
In
me.
1953,
Meet
Truman is going
breakdance,
to move
the absolute
the
worst WordPress website.
elections to Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the war would come to an end. Not due to any reason that or anything that Eisenhower did per se, but at the same time that Eisenhower becomes president of the United States, Joseph Stalin is going to die. A new group of communist leaders are going to come to power, and all sides are just going to rather have a peace, and they will sign a armistice or a ceasefire along the 38th parallel, not a peace treaty, but a more of a ceasefire that still exists up until today. The Korean War has actually not ever come to a conclusion. It was more of a ceasefire, which has lasted until today. Just scroll it back.
till both sides finally agreed to work towards a peace settlement in 2018. Back in America, Americans decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected famed World War II General Eisenhower, who was really hard to draw. It's 1953. Hey Stalin, how you doing? Oh, he's dead. He had a cerebral decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected famed World War II General Eisenhower, who was really hard to draw. It's 1953. Hey Stalin, how you doing? Oh, he's dead. He had a cerebral hemorrhage and his reign of terror kinda came back to bite him in the ass because he had imprisoned all of his best doctors and those that were left were too terrified to treat him. The new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, called a meeting and said, "Hey guys, you know how Stalin was imprisoning and murdering us all for doing basically nothing? Yeah, he was kind of a jerk. I'm really not sure how this is news to you." Khrushchev went on a campaign of de-Stalinization. Statues of Stalin were taken down, Stalingrad was renamed, and Khrushchev announced that he wanted the Soviet people to be happy and would allow greater freedom in the Soviet.
Stalin died in 1953. A new group of Soviet leaders took charge. By 1955, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the individual who would lead the Soviet Union, kind of a friendlier face on the Soviet Union than Stalin sought to create, but very quickly his power was tested. So he tried to, you know, create a friendlier version of communism, so to speak. Rather than make it a hostile military conflict, he wanted it to be more of an ideological conflict with the West, show that communism would triumph because it's a better economic policy. But very soon he's tested when there's uprisings. He has to put it down by force. And he does try to create better relations with the United States until spy plane is shot down. Eisenhower refuses to apologize, and that would kind of cause relations to worsen.
Union. So how did that work out? Well, an uprising in East Germany was brutally suppressed, a revolution in Hungary was brutally suppressed, and demonstrations in Poland were brutally suppressed. Although he did finally allow some mild reforms. Back in the Soviet Union, he permitted more cultural expression, but then began banning stuff based on his own personal taste. Modern art looks like a child urinated on a canvas. Banned. Jazz music sounds like the feeling of needing to fart. Banned. Your poetry is really depressing. How could anyone in the Soviet Union be depressed? You're banned. Khrushchev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but not like that, or that, or that. Young people began enjoying abhorrent Western pop culture. Son, remove that disgusting imperialist apparel at once. Shut up, Dad. You can't tell me what to do. Well, would you look at that? Turns out he can tell me what to do. The West had initially liked the cut of Khrushchev's jib, but world events soon soured relations even more. The two sides were spying on each other a whole lot throughout the Cold War. The KGB had spies and informants in nearly every aspect of Western life and government, so much so that whenever the US tried to send spies into the Soviet Union, the KGB were usually ready to arrest them on the spot. Members of the Manhattan Project aided the Soviet Union in acquiring the bomb. Some American officials believed they were on the wrong side. I'll sell you 3 secrets for $5 million. Okay, go ahead. The Allies are
That the Soviets developed an atomic bomb because of Soviet spies did create in the United States what will become known as the Red Scare or McCarthyism, where a senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, rose to fame by accusing basically everybody of being a communist. And it was kind of a period in American history where freedoms of individuals were curtailed because of this irrational fear of communism.
digging a tunnel under East Berlin to tap your communications. There's an American agent living at this address in Moscow, and sometimes, when I'm home alone, I like to put on my wife's dresses, sit in the corner, and cry for hours. Very interesting. In America, fear took hold during the Red Scare and the McCarthy trials. American values imploded as fear of communism collided with freedom of thought and expression, and communist kind of became a buzzword thrown around to describe anything people didn't like. Hollywood? Communist. Your next door neighbor's dog? Communist. When the grocery store cashier asks if you need a bag when you clearly can't carry 10 tubs of baconaise in your hands, communist. But one area in particular where the US had an edge over the Soviet Union was in its espionage technology. In particular, U-2 spy planes flew across Russia carrying out surveillance from the skies. There was a nasty incident in 1960 though, when one was
So
shot.
these U-2 spy planes, which could fly at a very high altitude, believed by the Americans to not be able to be spotted, were crucial in taking photographs and testing. Khrushchev would boast about the amount of intercontinental ballistic missiles that could carry nuclear warheads, and American spy planes were very important in verifying the extent to which this was true. At this time, relations between the Soviets and the Americans were better. After Stalin died, Khrushchev, went put a huge effort in trying to mend relations. Let's not have a hostile situation where a physical war would break out. Keep it just economic, and the better economic policy will win. But a spy plane was shot down, and when the plane was shot, the United States did not know what was discovered, and they came up with a cover story. Then, when more information was revealed that the Soviets had captured the pilots alive and they had discovered some of the spy equipment, they made up another story, which was also obviously not true. And Eisenhower just refused to apologize. So the fact that not only was the spy plane shot down, but the Americans lied about it really frustrated Khrushchev.
Down, and Khrushchev was furious. Who the hell is this? He's a high-altitude weather enthusiast who flew off course. Okay, that sounds plausible. Wait a minute. Why does he have a gun and a poison needle? Because he's a very naughty high-altitude weather enthusiast. But much to America's concern, the Soviet Union appeared to be ahead in the space race. Everyone freaked out when Russia launched the world's first satellite, and then they actually sent a man into space. Even worse, there also appeared to be a missile gap in the Soviets' favor, and Khrushchev was so confident that he even allowed the US to set up a technology exhibit in Moscow, attended by a certain Vice President Richard Nixon. Check this out. We have color TV. Yes, but we've been to space and can obliterate you with our massive nuclear arsenal. Check out this vegetable peeler. Tensions increased further when both sides upgraded their atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs. And after
When atomic bombs were created, they were thousands of times more powerful than conventional bombs. But then when the hydrogen bomb is developed, they're thousands of times more powerful than the atomic bombs. Now you really have the kind of ability where enough hydrogen bombs, both sides have the ability to destroy one another. And something that's going to characterize this whole Cold War conflict will be this notion of mutually assured destruction, especially as intercontinental ballistic missiles are developed. The whole idea is that the Soviets and the Americans have enough ballistic missiles and hydrogen bombs to wipe the other side out. So war is unwinnable because if one side attacks the other side, both sides will destroy one another. Therefore, it's in no one's best interest to actually have a nuclear war with one another. But when there is tension, like what's going to happen now during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there kind of is not just like in previous times throughout human history where you have a dangerous war, one empire will conquer the other. In this instance, you have the potential for global annihilation because of the power of hydrogen bombs.
Germany was allowed to join NATO in 1955, Khrushchev set up the Defensive Warsaw Pact, strengthening the military ties between the Soviet Union and its satellite states. In 1960, Americans decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected John F. Kennedy. The Soviet
Eisenhower's second term came to an end. Richard Nixon versus John F. Kennedy. Kennedy wins the elections.
Soviet Union was advancing its technology, but it was also bleeding its coffers dry, and all of the money was going towards the military, not the people. Life under communism was still as hard as ever, and Berlin remained a thorn in the Soviet side. The contrast between the economically prosperous West and the struggling East was clearer day by day, and East Berliners were still able to freely travel to the West. Now, many of them were deciding to stay there. Millions defected to West Germany via West Berlin, causing Eastern factories to lose workers and taking a heavy toll on the economy. Soviet leaders decided this couldn't continue any longer. First, Khrushchev tried this: leave West Berlin, or else. Or else what? Or else, I'll be really mad at you. Yeah, no, we're gonna stay. Listen, man, West Berlin is ours, East Berlin is yours. That's just how it is. Kennedy felt pretty good about his show of American resolve. But wait a second, did you catch that? Let's replay it.
East Berlin is yours.
Uh-oh, Kennedy just told Khrushchev that the USA wouldn't interfere in what the Soviets did with their section of Berlin, so Khrushchev came up with a new idea. We're gonna build a wall, and it's gonna be a big, beautiful wall, and it's gonna keep out all the Mexicans. No, sir, that's wrong, it's gonna keep in these Berliners. Oh, sorry, it's gonna keep in all the Mexicans. On August 13th, 1961, Berliners woke up to find their city divided into two, with barbed wire and guards blocking the border between East and West. Over time, a wall was constructed throughout the city. Families were torn apart. Thousands would risk their lives escaping over the wall, and hundreds would die trying. To the despair of Berliners, the West were unable to do anything about it, but the wall did put on full display the failure of the communist system. As Kennedy said, democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in. As part of the agreement between the two sides, US diplomats were still allowed to travel to East Berlin, but suddenly, East Berlin crossing guards started giving them the business, and Kennedy was like, nah. In October, the US rolled tanks up to the crossing point at Checkpoint Charlie as a show of strength. The Soviets did the same, and the two were in a standoff. They stayed like that for 16 hours, and the world braced for nuclear Armageddon. Thankfully, though, Kennedy called Khrushchev directly and was like, hey man, this is getting way too hot. How about you back your tanks up by an inch and we'll do the same? Sounds good. Okay, how about you back your tanks up by another inch and we'll follow suit? Alright, hey, you want to do another inch? And they both very slowly inched away from the apocalypse. Phew, let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency.
Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Almost the end of this video. But when Kennedy says that's the biggest crisis, what he's setting the context up for now is the Cuban Missile Crisis. In a country neighboring the United States, 1959, year before Kennedy becomes president, there's the Cuban Revolution, where Fidel Castro overthrows Batista as the leader of Cuba, and Castro takes over. Now, Castro doesn't declare himself a communist. He's kind of called himself a nationalist. Travels to the United States to meet Eisenhower, doesn't get a meeting, has some problems with a lot of American-owned companies there, makes the decision to nationalize certain American companies. Relations break off between Castro and the United States. He starts moving more towards the Soviets. Eisenhower has a Bay of Pigs invasion where they're going to send Cuban exiles, those who had left Cuba during Castro's revolution, to return with American firepower and support, overthrow Castro, take control of Cuba. Kennedy becomes president before this Bay of Pigs invasion takes place. It's initiated and started by Eisenhower. Kennedy decides to scale it down, ends up being a massive disaster. Castro feels unsafe. During the spy plane incident, where the U-2 spy planes were flying over the Soviet Union, Khrushchev realized that the Americans would be aware that he did not have long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles. So he could threaten about having the potential to destroy the United States, but at least at this stage, in the 1960s, he didn't have that potential yet. He had a lot of medium-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, but being the Soviet Union, it's simply too far away to be any threat to the Americans. But on the island of Cuba, right there near the United States, if he puts those medium-range intercontinental ballistic missiles in Cuba and station it there, then he does have the potential to destroy the United States if there is a nuclear confrontation. So this is going to be a very huge stalemate, because before those nuclear stations are fitted in Cuba, the Americans spot it, and a very, very tense situation is going to develop, and that will become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is part one of Oversimplified's video. I will make part two shortly. Thank you.